whenever I needed to, and to understand my rabbinate better and how I can best serve liberal Jews. We're so honoured that Rabbi Mark, as co-chair, co-Rosh head of our Beit Din, is here this evening to kickstart our Liberal Judaism at 120 sessions on Liberal Judaism in practice. We've got some super sessions coming up. They're a little bit disjointed this time because of Purim and other things, I think me mistaking one or two dates as well. But it's great to be joined again by so many friends within Liberal Judaism, wanting to understand a little bit more about our Judaism, and at the same time, just wanting to be together as Liberal Jews in this 120th year, looking to celebrate together, studying a little bit, discussing a little bit, and also being able just to see lots of faces from around the UK and abroad that makes us celebrate our Liberal Judaism even more. We sincerely hope that we might be able to join together later on in the year, in person if we're able to, at our day of celebration and other opportunities. But if not, this is just a wonderful environment for us to be able to join together in. So I'm going to hand over to Mark, who's going to speak. We'll have plenty of time for some questions and answers. And as ever, we promise to conclude by the latest 8:30. Mark.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you, Aaron, for the lovely introduction. And thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to Tom for doing a lot of the admin for this. Okay, so I'm the rabbi of the Edinburgh and Leicester Liberal Jewish communities, and I'm also a senior lecturer at Leo Beck College, which trains liberal and reform rabbis, as most of you will know. And that's the job I've had for longest. I've been teaching at Leo Beck College since late 1991. And back in late 1991, I was still officially an Orthodox rabbi. I was minister at Watford United Synagogue, but was on the verge of deciding that I couldn't carry on as an Orthodox rabbi, and was going to seek another way, another place to be a rabbi. And the reason, my personal reason for that was because I was gay and I was in the process of coming out. But in that process of thinking through what my identity meant for my Jewish life, it led me to think about all sorts of questions of identity and status and exclusion and inclusion, particularly the discrimination against women in many aspects of traditional Judaism. It was really through feminist insights, feminist Jewish theology, that I was able finally to kind of burst out of the cocoon myself in a way, and realize that there was Judaism outside of Orthodoxy that was just as valid. It was while I was teaching, began teaching at Leo Beck College, so probably sometime in the course of 1992, when I was gearing up to leave my job as an Orthodox rabbi in Watford and look for something else, that I met an interesting person in the library in Leo Beck College. Her name is Evelyn Wilcock, and she's still around, still with us. She lives in South London, and she was a member of the LJS, the Liberal Jewish Synagogue in St. John's Wood. And we encountered one another browsing through the shelves in the Leo Beck College library. And she explained to me that her work, which she was very involved in at the time, was campaigning for the rights of patrilineal Jews, that is, people with Jewish fathers, but not with Jewish mothers. And for me, coming from an Orthodox background, this was all very strange. and new, because it's so deeply ingrained, as many of you will know, in traditional Jewish consciousness, and also in the minds of lots of non-Jews out there as well. It's sometimes one of the few things that people know about Judaism, is that Jewish status is transmitted down through the mother. Yeah, and you can only be Jewish if you have a Jewish mother, or if you've converted to Judaism. But in terms of Jewish by birth, only the mother counts and the father doesn't count. So people with Jewish fathers and non-Jewish mothers, who might often have a very Jewish family name, and obviously have Jewish grandparents, family members, maybe be involved in lots of Jewish family activities, but are nevertheless brought up realizing that they're not accepted in the Jewish community. They're not Jewish. Yeah? And it was through my conversations with Evelyn Wilcock that I really began thinking about this. And it was certainly, I would say, one of the most challenging things for me, one of the most challenging adjustments to make in transitioning from United Synagogue Orthodox to liberal Judaism, as I eventually did, having looked at various other options, but I ended up, as it were, falling into liberal Judaism because I was offered a job at a liberal synagogue. And it was definitely one of the trickiest things for me to negotiate, was this really significant difference that in liberal Judaism, by that time, it was becoming a more and more accepted principle that we treat children of Jewish mothers and children of Jewish fathers equally, and that anyone with a Jewish parent can be considered Jewish if they have Jewish upbringing. And exactly how we define Jewish upbringing is a sort of a subtle question, and it often comes down to very detailed conversations between rabbis and the people with the Jewish parents. But this and Evelyn Wilcock was one of the main people who had made this happen. And it was in that period of the 1980s and 1990s that this was becoming an established principle. I don't really know what the story was much further back than that, but it was certainly the case also in the American Reform movement, our much larger sibling movement over in America, that this same process was happening, particularly through the leadership of the great Rabbi Alexander Schindler, one of the most charismatic and forward-thinking leaders of American Reform Judaism, that he brought in this as a firmly accepted principle. I think before that it had been, yeah, maybe not, and nobody was quite sure, but he really made this a recognized principle of Reform Judaism in America, that we don't discriminate against people because it was the wrong parent that was Jewish. And it was through Evelyn Wilcock and sympathetic rabbis. Speaking of rabbis, I just saw Rabbi Judith Rosenberry's joined us. Hi, Judith. That this change had happened in liberal Judaism. And I was coming in, as it were, on the coattails of this quite important policy decision. I'm going to share with you on the screen there the title page of a little book. It's 32 pages long, and this is Evelyn Wilcock's book called The Half-Jew and the Synagogue: Jewish Failure or Jewish Future. And this is a wonderful document and full of fascinating research. She was a very good researcher, facts, figures, and impassioned argument for the justice of including patrilineal Jews and recognizing their Jewish status without asking them to go through a conversion process. And for Evelyn Wilcock, this was really a matter of justice, of fairness, of equity, of putting right a kind of historic wrong, as it were. And for me, as a very new liberal rabbi then, I think I was still in my 20s even, who was sort of coming out as gay and kind of dealing with the injustice of the way that traditional Judaism treated LGBT people, it actually became very easy for me once I'd been talking to Evelyn and reading her book and getting my head around it, that here was a very similar issue in a way, another group of people who had been excluded, marginalized, told, well, you're not good enough, you're not kosher because it was your father, not your mother, who was Jewish. And so I became absolutely 100% convinced that this was the right thing. In fact, a few years later, when somebody asked me if I'd like to come and join the Reform movement in Britain, the then head of the Reform movement, I said, well, thank you very much, but no, because I really believe that this is the right thing. And at that time, the Reform movement, that's the British Reform movement, didn't accept patrilineal Jews and did ask them to go through a sort of conversion process in order to be recognized as Jewish. I'm very happy to say that within the last maybe 4 years or so, 4 or 5 years, I lose track of time, the British Reform movement has kind of come round to our liberal point of view and now has a process by which patrilineal Jews can be recognized as Jewish without having to go through anything that is like a conversion process. And that's a wonderful development that has brought Reform and liberal Judaism much, much closer together, along with other changes they've made, all of which have been coming in the liberal direction. Yeah, allowing same-sex marriages and mixed marriage blessings and all sorts of things that liberal Judaism has been doing for a long time, and the Reform movement has sort of caught up. So if anybody here is Reform and thinks that I'm being unfair, you're welcome to say so. So that's a little bit of the personal history that I thought I'd share. It's taken a while. And before I launch into a bit of sort of more academic background to this, I'll just give a couple of minutes if anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment about this, or if anyone has an experience to share briefly, if you can. I'll allow a bit of time for that. Anybody?
Only to say that we have someone joining us tonight who's also is a member of a Reform community as well, which will not be mentioned in terms of name, but has actually said that they would possibly the Reform community have said that they would break away from Reform Judaism if they were to be forced to accept patrilineality. So it's not a clear-cut kind of thing in the UK. And if we were to throw all, the work in progress, and if we were to throw all of the balls of the liberal and Reform synagogues in the country up in the air, would they all fall down in the same way? We don't quite know, but it's not, it's very much not quite as clear. And we've got a couple of questions, I think. Leah, please do help me out here as well.
I can see Alexandra.
Yeah.
I think Alison might have put her hand up.
Yeah, Alison also had her hand up.
And we've got a question in the chat, which I'll come to in a minute as well. It's just been to me, but I will come to that. So who's first? Alexandra?
Hi, thanks. So with me, it's not the patrilineal sort of question. I found out I was Jewish through a genetic test, through the BRCA gene, and then over time I sort of found out that my grandmother actually was Jewish. But because we haven't got any papers, and my mum is dead, my grandmother is dead, there's no family left, I haven't got no papers. So I'm going through conversion now. But it's I sort of know the feeling of you know, how they must have felt. So sort of on the outside.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and best of luck with that. And Alison Dollar, do you want to?
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure if there was another one. No, it's okay. I'm all right. But just to let you know, I'm one of Andrea's congregants.
Oh, I see. Right. Yes.
Okay. That's all I can say.
Yes. So as you say, work in progress in
Yeah.
some Reform communities. Yes. Okay. I'm good friends with Andrea. I bar mitzvahed his son.
Yes, I know.
Yeah,
You were there.
yeah.
I was there when you did Hula. So.
Yeah. But we don't necessarily agree about everything. Okay. Lovely. And now I've had a question in the chat asking me, can I clarify what is meant by Jewish upbringing? And that's a very good question. What does Jewish upbringing mean? So there are two ways in which, as it were, people get their sort of Jewish status recognized within liberal Judaism and liberal communities as patrilineal Jews. One way is if they're children who are born in a liberal congregation, and the father's Jewish and the mother isn't. And of course, we have many mixed families in our congregations with all sorts of different combinations, and we welcome that very much. And so if a child is brought up within a liberal synagogue and goes to Cheder and part of our community, then there's absolutely no question that we recognize that child as Jewish equally with someone else with two Jewish parents or a Jewish mother or whatever other cases there may be. But the slightly more complex one is when somebody comes as an adult who perhaps has felt a pull to Judaism because of the family background on their father's side, but never felt they were accepted because maybe, in Anglo Jewry, of course, the default is United Synagogue, and many people don't even know that there is a different option, that liberal Judaism offers a different kind of solution. And when they find out, they come to the rabbi and ask, can I be accepted as Jewish, or do I need to convert? And then it's a conversation, often a very deep and interesting one between the rabbi and the person. And it will focus on their experiences growing up. Were they in touch with their father's family? Did they have Jewish grandparents? Did they have Jewish occasions in their life, like Shabbat or Seders on Pesach, or family dinners on Rosh Hashanah? Did they go to Israel? Did people at school think of them as Jewish? Maybe they got bullied because they had a Jewish name and people thought they were, kind of Jewish, and all sorts of things like that. And if there are other significant questions that I haven't included, Aaron or Leah or Judith, anyone else is welcome to add any of other sorts of things that we might discuss with people. And sometimes, and usually, if you dig a bit, then people do come up with a surprising amount of Jewish experience and feeling and influence in their lives, even if they were never officially recognized as Jewish. So that's the kind of thing we mean by upbringing. Obviously, if they had any formal Jewish education, that is a very strong sign of Jewish upbringing. Sometimes it happens people didn't have much when they were young children, but when they went to university, they joined the JSOC and made lots of Jewish friends and did all the JSOC, Purims and Hanukkahs and festivals and things. And and I've accepted people who maybe didn't have much Jewish stuff going on in their childhood, but as students, they got very into it. And sometimes it happens, of course, when people come to get married to their Jewish fiance, and they would like their Jewishness to be recognized so they can have a Jewish wedding without having to go through all the long rigmarole of a conversion. So there are all kinds of ways in which this can happen. Aaron?
just wanted to draw attention to the fact that, I introduced Rabbi Mark as my teacher, and very much he is my teacher, was my teacher, is and will be hopefully in the future as well. And at the same time, he has deferred to me and to Rabbi Leah and to Rabbi Judith. And I think that that is also a very important principle that we just want to draw out as well. That we do have a set of connection with our rabbinic colleagues and respect for them as well. And that if I had a question, I would actually bring it to Rabbi Mark or Rabbi Margaret as co-chairs of our Beit Din to discuss it with them. So rather than feel undermined because I'm a junior or whatever else, there is that definite sense that we would come to and we would discuss amongst ourselves. We don't have a chief rabbi. We don't have an actual head of the Beit Din who does, or I think Rabbi Mark might explain a bit more about the word dayan, but we don't have somebody who actually says, this is exactly what you have to stick to. We have a conversation about it. So where we're unsure, where there's grey areas, we might come and discuss it. I just want to make that point because I think, thank you. I mean, Mark, that's something which actually meant a lot to me when you just said that. And I think that was an important point.
Karen, thank you. And I've got a hand up from Anna Sanderson. And then we're going to sort of shift things a bit to something a bit more kind of academic after that. So Anna.
Hi, so I just wanted to comment that I'm a patrilineal Jew, and I grew up in with my observant grandmother and my secular dad, who were members of the United Synagogue. So it's absolutely broke my heart when I was a bit older and people would tell me I wasn't Jewish. It just didn't make sense to me. So I just wanted to highlight that because it's even ingrained in me that I wasn't born Jewish because my mother wasn't Jewish. Yeah. And I can see the parallels between somebody like myself and the LGBTQ community. I really can see the parallels, but I still respect some of the teachings of the Orthodox movement too.
Lovely, thank you.
Yeah, just wanted to say that.
That's very moving to hear, and thank you for sharing that, Anna. So what I want to do now is turn to the sources, because again, going way back to those old days at Leovet College, with my conversations with Evelyn Wilcock, I began thinking, well, I really need to look into this as someone whose job was teaching Talmud and so forth. I really need to look into the sources, which I'd never really studied in depth before, and find out why this law is there and what's the basis of it and so on and so forth. And of course, when you start studying something really deeply, you discover all kinds of interesting things, and that the situation is far more complex and far more nuanced than, popular wisdom has it. So if you're talking about popular wisdom, what most people would say is Judaism has a matrilineal principle, which says that your religious affiliation depends on your mother. If your mother is Jewish, then you're definitely 100% Jewish, no questions. And if your mother is not Jewish, regardless of anything else, then you're absolutely not Jewish, end of story. And it's presented as, cut and dried. And then people will go on from there and say, well, if people discuss why that is matrilineal, then you get all sorts of things that people come out with. Let me ask you, what are your ideas or things that you've heard about why it follows the mother? Anybody, any ideas that you know about?
Because you know who the mother is.
Okay, I've got Oliver and somebody else. Ollie, you go first.
Well, I don't know whether there's a textual basis for this, but it's you always know who the mother was back in the day before you could actually.
Good. Okay. So that is one. Somebody has put that in the chat as well. You always know your mother, but not your father. That's right. Okay, so we can all acknowledge that that is the case. And fine. There was certainly a principle in Roman law that said the mother is certain, the father is uncertain. So maybe this was a bit of influence from Roman law, but the rabbis have lots and lots of discussions about this question of, the basis for, the going through the mother and so forth. And nowhere ever do they say that this is the reason. Nowhere ever do they say this. And you'd expect if it was as simple as all that, then at least some rabbi sometime, in the classical sources, in the Talmud, would have mentioned the idea, but they don't mention it. Okay, so that's one idea. Anna, you have one to suggest?
I was always led to believe that it's something along the lines of the Jewish soul is imparted from the mother when the child is born.
Right.
So
okay.
Questions about whether people feel they have a Jewish soul or not, but it was imparted through the mother or through a conversion.
Okay, right. Okay, well, I'm not sure that I really believe in Jewish souls, but of course some people do. And there are strands of Judaism that believe Jewish souls are radically different from non-Jewish souls. Personally, I think that's completely racist, but I won't go into that right now. But I know for some people, it is very important to think about, what it means to have a Jewish soul. And I know many converts find it important to feel that they always had a Jewish soul, which found its way into Judaism and so forth. And that's all very nice. I think you probably get that message through Chabad, I suspect. That's probably where that particular kind of emphasis comes through, that it's something to do with Jewish souls. But I have to tell you that Jewish law, and we're talking here about a legal issue, not a kind of metaphysical issue. And on the legal issue, on the legal side of things, souls are never mentioned, never, ever, ever. So whatever that may or may not be true from a sort of Kabbalistic point of view, but it's certainly not mentioned in the Talmud, and couldn't possibly have been the reason why this rule was made, because they didn't discuss things like that in those terms back in the days of the Talmud. Okay. I know that might not satisfy everybody, but that's just my instant and brief response to that. Any other ideas? Oh, I was expecting to hear at least one other idea, which is something that almost always crops up, which was that they made this rule because lots of Jewish women got raped by marauding Romans, Cossacks, I don't know who, crusaders, whatever, and the rabbis wanted to be compassionate and to allow their children that they might have conceived to be accepted in the Jewish community and not, not excluded. And so it was about that.
I think Kelly Dankner mentioned that actually in the chat, but
No,
it doesn't matter. She said you always know your mother, but not your father.
Oh no, we already dealt with that. That's a different point.
Different one.
Slightly different point. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. Very interesting. Thank you, Leah, for your comment there as well, which we'll come back to. And mitochondrial DNA, yeah, very interesting scientific concept that there's a particular kind of DNA. It's not your own human DNA, it's the DNA of these little things that live inside us called mitochondria that help our cells process energy, that comes down through the mother, so you can trace the maternal line through that. But needless to say, while I'm sure God knows about mitochondria, the ancient rabbis certainly didn't when they were laying down rules. So I don't think that was the reason. One thing that's very important to say is this rule appears nowhere in the Bible, certainly not in the Torah, not in any way recognizable to us. We'll come back to that later. time permitting. But this is not a biblical rule. The Torah never says Jewish status goes through the mother. So we're looking for really rules within Rabbinic Judaism, within the Talmud and Rabbinic literature, that will clarify this, because that's where we first find these rules laid down. So yeah, the idea about rape. Which nobody mentioned, but I've mentioned, that it was about compassion for women who'd been violated and their children. That's a lovely idea. There is one place in the Talmud that it mentions women who'd been captured in war, or captured or taken as slaves by non-Jews and were ransomed. And one of the women was pregnant, and the rabbis of the time, this was in the beginning of the 4th century thereabouts, in the Galilee and Tiberias, the rabbis were asked to give a ruling. This child that was going to be born, presumably of result of rape, what would its status be? And the rabbis said that it would be a mamzer. And a mamzer means, loosely translated as a bastard, but it means a child who can't marry within the Jewish community, except for some very, very limited categories of people, like another mamzer. But a child who would have a very difficult life because they won't be able to marry into pretty much any Jewish family. That's not a good decision. I mean, it's not a happy decision. And if the idea was to be compassionate to the mother, then telling her child would be a mamzer isn't a very compassionate or kind thing to do. Oh, thank you, Leah. Another suggested reason is the natural closeness of a child to the mother, and that your first childhood influences and your, deepest kind of sense of identity comes with the mother's milk, as it were. And again, it's a lovely idea, and I'm sure the rabbis thought about such things, but they never ever mentioned that as a reason for this rule. So, what could it be? Now, the short answer is nobody really knows, because the rabbis never explain very clearly their thinking on this. Yeah, and there are quite a lot of interesting scholarly discussions about it, and all of the reasons that we've just mentioned are considered, and academic scholars pretty much dismiss most of them. So I'm sharing with you now a sort of study document that I've worked on over the years, and I teach this stuff quite a lot at Leo Baeck College. In fact, I'm teaching it right now at Leo Baeck College this semester to some of my students. And we're looking at all the Talmudic sources in great detail, and they're very difficult. So we're not doing that tonight. But there's a few bits that I want to highlight. So contrary to popular opinion, there is no matrilineal principle in the Talmud. The Talmudim, that means the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, two different Talmuds, discuss two questions, mostly fairly separately. One is the status of children of Jewish fathers and non-Jewish mothers. Yeah, and quite separately, they discuss the status of children of Jewish mothers and non-Jewish fathers. Okay, and this can get quite confusing, and you can get quite muddled very quickly when you start trying to keep these two clear in your head. But there are different questions, and they're discussed in quite different ways in the Talmud. There is only one statement by a late Talmudic scholar of the 5th century who connects the two cases, but this is centuries after the discussions began, and until that time the discussions had taken place quite separately about these two different cases. Now, when we talk about patrilineal status, then we're clearly talking about what I've called here case one, the case of the Jewish father and the non-Jewish mother. Yeah, patrilineal Jews. And here we find quite early on in the Mishnah, there is a dominant view that Havalad kemota, the Hebrew says there, the offspring is like her. In other words, in this case, the offspring definitely follows the mother, that is the non-Jewish side. Yeah, and there's a number of statements here that we're not looking at closely because we've only got 20 minutes left, summarizing that. But the statement that I want to look at, this decision is already there in the Mishnah in the early stages of rabbinic legislation. But a very interesting statement comes in the Gemara, in the commentary on the Mishnah, and it reads as follows. And let's look at this version of it. Bincha haba min Yisraelit karui bincha, ve'ein bincha haba min ha'ovedet kochavim karui bincha ela banah. Which means your son by an Israelite woman is called your son, but your son by a heathen woman is not called your son, but her son. And we'll leave aside for the moment, what it means exactly by heathen, but basically it's generally accepted that this just means not Jewish, generally any non-Jew. Okay, so my question is on this, who is being addressed here? Who is being addressed? Your son by an Israelite woman is called your son. So clearly the person being addressed here is a Jewish man, yeah, or more specifically, perhaps a Jewish father or would-be father, yeah. And what is the concern of this Jewish man? The concern, I would argue, based on the implications of these words, is that Jewish men are concerned about having Jewish children, about having children who are fully their children and will carry on their heritage after them. That's what in sort of patriarchal systems, and ancient Judaism was a patriarchal system. This is a key concern. Fathers, as it were, perpetuating their line and their identity. And that goes along with property and all sorts of other things, of course. So how do Jewish fathers have Jewish sons? And what the rabbis are saying to them is, you could only have a Jewish son if the son is born of an Israelite woman, that is a Jewish woman. But if you have a child by a non-Jewish woman, then that child will not be called your son. So what I get from this is, and this is my conclusion, which I could argue for much longer, but I won't, is that the reason this rule is there is that the rabbis made this rule to prevent Jewish men marrying out. Yeah, their concern was that in a patriarchal society, as I said, ancient Jewish culture was very patriarchal. We know that generally speaking, men would stay put and women, the wives, would come and live with the patriarchal family. Yeah, this is the case in the Bible. Daughters are given or taken in marriage and they enter the paternal household, as it were. So it would be very easy for Jewish men to marry a woman, a wife of their choice, Jewish or not Jewish, and say, well, I'm bringing this woman into my household, and therefore the children that are born will be my children and grow up in my household, and obviously they'll be Jewish. And what I see here is a great urge, as it were, from the rabbinic authorities of the time to stop that happening and to make sure that Jewish men only marry Jewish women, to keep the line pure. Now, this is a theory. You don't have to accept it. Other scholars, some very important scholars, have other theories about it, being influenced by Roman law or some other considerations. But this is how I read this statement. There are some dissenting views, interestingly. Yeah, I don't want to put too much stress on this because they are very much minority views. Generally, the form that these views take would be that maybe the children of a Jewish father and a Jewish mother would be Jewish, but would be mamzerim, would be illegitimate birth, with not able to marry generally in the Jewish community. Okay, so I put my conclusion at the bottom of that page there. Let's move on. Now, I know that what we're mostly interested in nowadays is patrilineal Jews, because for matrilineal Jews, those born of a Jewish mother, it's been accepted for centuries that they're Jewish. Yeah, no, that's fine. So that's not really a problem. But this wasn't always the case. Yeah. So my comment here is the position that we've just talked about, that Jewish status. So I have to take a step back here. Okay, right. Thank you, Owen, for your your comment. So there's a passage in the Mishnah that that discusses status of children, and it says, when there is a valid marriage and no transgression, in other words, this is a valid marriage that is completely permitted and kosher according to Jewish law, then the offspring follows the male. And what case is this? Says the Mishnah, this is the case of a Cohen, Levite, or Israelite who marries a female Cohen, Levite, or Israelite. Yeah, now Cohenim, Levites, and Israelites were the three principal categories of Jews. Yeah, and so we know that the status of a Cohen follows the father. Yeah, you're a Cohen if your father was a Cohen. In liberal Judaism, we don't follow those things so much, but that is very important in traditional Judaism. Yeah, if your father's a Levite, you're a Levite. If your father's an Israelite, you're an Israelite. And it doesn't really matter what the mother's status is. Yeah. So the question is, does that apply to Jewish status with a sort of capital J as well? And my argument is that yes, it clearly does. That when there is a valid Jewish marriage between two Jews and no prohibitions involved, then Jewish status follows the father. Now, this is a controversial statement, and lots of people probably wouldn't agree with it nowadays. But when you look at the ancient sources, I think that emerges very, very clearly. So the only case where Jewish status follows the mother is where there is no Jewish father. Okay. Normally, Jewish status follows the father. I know that's not what Chabad will tell you, because they'll talk about Jewish souls and coming somehow through the female side and so on and so forth, all connected with profound Kabbalistic ideas and so forth. But as I say, those ideas were developed much, much later, from the Middle Ages onwards, and were not part of the original legislation. Now, I know we're running very short on time, so I'm just going to go back to my, hopefully we'll have 5 minutes for questions in 7 minutes time or thereabouts. Yeah, so the position that Jewish status derives from the father through the necessary intermediary of a Jewish mother, as we've just seen. Yeah, your child by an Israelite woman is called your child. This created the anomaly that the child of a Jewish mother by a non-Jewish father had no clear source of Jewish status. And in the Tannaitic period, the majority opinion was that the child inherited the Jewish status of the mother. Yeah, so they did allow that much. But since its lineage was blemished, it was a mamzer, unable to marry freely among Jews of unblemished lineage. And so this is the oldest ruling on the subject. An idolater or slave, let's not worry about the slaves right now, who cohabits with a daughter of Israel, the offspring is a mamzer. And I've listed there all of the sages who say that, and there's lots of them, including the most famous ones, Rabbi Akiva, and all sorts of other very important figures. And it's only later that another ruling is made, a dissenting ruling that comes in later, which is that if an idolater or slave cohabits with a daughter of Israel, the offspring is kasher, which means kosher. Yeah? And that begins as a very much a minority ruling. Only a couple of rabbis of the Mishnah period seem to say that. It begins to become more popular in the Amoraic period amongst the later rabbis of the Gemara, but it takes a while for it to be accepted. It takes a while. Eventually it is accepted, but it's by no means a quick process. It takes at least a couple of centuries for the view that the child is kasher to be accepted. Now, most people interpret the word kasher to mean a valid Jew. Yeah, so the child is a Jew and not a mamzer, and therefore valid, fit to marry widely into the Jewish community. Although it has to be said that according to some passages in the Talmud and many later rabbis, the child of a Jewish mother and non-Jewish father is not allowed to marry a Kohen. And I believe, I found out recently to this day in the United Synagogue, if someone comes along who's a child of a Jewish mother and non-Jewish father, so they're Jewish, but the rabbi probably would not do a wedding with a Kohen. Yeah. But this is quite a controversial point, and not everybody agrees with it. What I want to draw your attention to in a couple of minutes, though, is the opinion of Tosafot. Now, Tosafot is a very important medieval commentary on the Talmud. It appears opposite Rashi on every page of the Talmud. It's a whole collection of scholars from in the 12th and 13th centuries who collectively created this very learned, analytical, profound, difficult commentary. And Tosafot has a really radical, quite extraordinary interpretation of this. Tosafot says that kasher, in this context, that the child of a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father is kosher, doesn't mean a kosher Jew, but a kosher non-Jew. Yeah, it's a slightly strange idea, I guess, to many of us, but a kosher non-Jew. But what's the benefit of that? The benefit of that is that if the alternative is being a mamzer, a Jew who can't marry in the Jewish community, then Tosafot says it's much better for them to be a valid non-Jew who could then convert to Judaism and marry into the community. Yeah, so the child then has a choice. It can be non-Jewish like its father, or convert to Judaism like the mother, and then be able to marry freely within the Jewish community. So that's Tosafot's view in the Middle Ages, and I could show you all the text, but we don't have time for that. I want to, I'm going to skip all of that. Oh yes, now let's look at this. Now, Solomon, there are a couple of different views about this. A great scholar, Solomon Luria, not to be confused with Isaac Luria, the Kabbalist. They were more or less contemporary, but Solomon Luria lived in Poland. Great scholar of the time. He suggests that what this means is that the child of a Jewish father and non-Jewish father and Jewish mother is in a kind of intermediate status and is only a Jew if brought up as such, and otherwise needs to convert. This is a commentary that you find at the back of the volume of the Talmud in very small print at the bottom, but he's a very great scholar and people pay attention to what he says. And there's another view of the Kabbalist Yom Tov Al-Ghazi, another important scholar and commentator on the Talmud, who considers such a child to be part Jew, part non-Jew, with its upbringing to determine which part predominates and to establish its status. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing at this point. because we don't have time to look at all the texts in detail. So what this means is that some very great and extremely orthodox rabbis of past centuries were not satisfied with the idea that a child of a Jewish mother and non-Jewish father is kind of automatically Jewish, end of story. They said, no, that doesn't make sense. It should depend on the child's upbringing. If the child is brought up by its mother, maybe the father isn't even known, all kinds of situations of, where the father isn't there, and the child is brought up by its mother within a Jewish family, then yes, the child is Jewish. But if the Jewish mother is married to the non-Jewish father and the child is brought up in the father's family in a non-Jewish environment, then no, the child isn't Jewish and would need to convert. Now, this is all concerning children of Jewish mothers. Now, those opinions never gained wide acceptance, although some modern rabbis have suggested that they should be revisited, but they haven't gained wide acceptance. And most people are quite happy that children of Jewish mothers are Jewish, end of story. But the fact that these rabbis could contemplate the idea of Jewish status not being entirely dependent on birth, which parent is Jewish, but rather on upbringing, I think shows that when we as liberal Jews say, well, this should apply whether the father or the mother is Jewish. And if the child is brought up Jewish, then yes, they're Jewish. But if they weren't brought up Jewish, then they'd need to convert. So in other words, our liberal idea that is very important to us nowadays, that Jewish status isn't kind of automatic by virtue of birth, at least if there's only one Jewish parent, but should depend, at least to some extent, on Jewish upbringing, has precedence in very traditional Jewish thinking. I could go further because the situation is even more complex than that. And there are texts that say that if this applies to the children of Jewish mothers, then it should also apply to the children of Jewish fathers, depending on which rabbinic view you take. But either that's getting too complex, and I've probably lost you by now. So I'm going to stop talking and allow a few minutes for questions. Not very many, I can see. Somebody has asked me about what about converting a baby. This is a very complex question. I'm not going to respond exactly to the situation that you've mentioned, Ross. What I do want to mention is the situation that used to apply quite routinely in Italy and in some other places as well, where it was quite common, relatively common, for Jewish men to marry out. But it was routinely done that their children would be converted to Judaism, kind of no questions asked, by the Orthodox rabbis as soon as they were born. If they were boys, they'd have a bris and convert to Judaism and have a bris as babies and be brought up Jewish. And this was just an accepted thing. And it's only in recent times that stricter Orthodox views came in, and rabbis, including Chabad rabbis, started saying, no, we don't automatically convert children at birth, and we don't encourage people to marry out and think that they can still have their Jewish children. And they stopped that. They put a stop to it. And that's why liberal Judaism began in Italy in the 1990s and early 2000s, because a lot of people were very unhappy with this high-handed approach of this new rabbinic view that we won't allow Jewish fathers to have Jewish children by this process of converting them as babies. And this is how liberal Judaism gained a foothold in Italy, where it never had before, because traditional Italian Orthodox Judaism was so relaxed, they never felt a need for liberal Judaism, but that's changed.
And,
okay.
Mark, we should say that if anybody wishes to or is visiting Italy this summer, they're welcome to join one of our colleagues, Rabbi Ariel Friedlander, who is serving there. And there are a number of progressive communities as well. So if you want to attend a Shabbat service there as well, then you're very, very welcome. Sorry, I was giving a bit of time for Mark to read some of the chat as well.
Yeah.
So he might like to respond to it or not.
All right. Who was that? Somebody. All right. Somebody's asked, did I feel that I converted from Orthodox to liberal Judaism? Well, no is the brief answer. No, I would never have described it as a conversion, an awakening, perhaps. A liberation is how I experienced it. A liberation, and not just because of the whole LGBT thing, and that definitely was a liberation in that respect, but in many other respects. There are lots of other things I'd been profoundly uncomfortable with for years in more traditional forms of Judaism, particularly Jewish attitudes towards non-Jews within Chabad and so forth, that it really I found very, very, very difficult, and almost drove me out of Judaism altogether. So when I discovered liberal Judaism, and when we say Oseh Shalom, and we don't just say Al Kol Yisrael, but Al Kol Bnei Adam, for peace for everybody, that to me was one of the most liberating things that's ever happened. Yeah, that we're not just concerned about ourselves, but we think about the welfare of all people, the rest of the world as well. So yes, I found liberal Judaism a liberation, not a conversion. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Mark. And knowing that we said we'd keep a relatively strict timing as well, I just want to thank Mark. You've raised some questions. I've got more questions to ask you in the future as well, but you've also helped me with my own thinking this evening, and I'm sure with everybody else's as well. It's been a fascinating evening listening to you, and I know that we'll be able to think again into the future. Rabbi Leah, if you want to take over.
I was just thinking, I don't know about Rabbi Mark's plans, but Shavuot is coming up, and of course this topic is also a relevant topic for Shavuot. So if there is interest to continuing this conversation, maybe we could think about for our joint Tikkun Leil Shavuot to have a follow-on on this session.
Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Sounds absolutely fascinating to me. And just want to say on behalf of everybody, thank you so much indeed. I can listen to you for a long time, but also want to eat my dinner, as others might as well. And we promised people 8:30. Thank you also very, very much indeed for everything that you have offered and contributed to this evening. Please spread the word around your communities as well. We're delighted to have so many people joining us from so many communities. Tell everybody in your community to come along in 2 weeks' time, I think it is, because next Wednesday evening is Erev Purim, and you may have activities going on within your communities. You'll be joining me. Sorry about that. Hopefully someone will introduce me as we're talking about marriage in some shape or form, partnerships, however you want to call it, and we'll be talking about issues around that. But this evening, I've got lots more questions that hopefully we'll come back to on Shavuot. And just a huge thank you to Rabbi Mark Solomon, our co-Rosh HaBeit Din, our co-chair of our Beit Din, Rabbi of our Edinburgh and Leicester communities, and our teacher as well, not only this evening, but past, present, and future. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Aaron. Thanks for all your excellent questions. And I'm sorry if I didn't manage to answer everything that you'd have liked. Lovely to see you all, and including some members of my communities as well. And Mark Schultz, lovely to see you there, Mark, and Tomer. And everybody, lots of friendly faces.